you, Cahill, and I welcome the opportunity to contribute to the debate today on housing and homelessness policy in the state. And there's no doubt, Minister, as has been said by other speakers, that there is a crisis in the provision of housing and in the homelessness and dealing with homelessness in this state. And the two are intrinsically linked, and there's no doubt about that. And dealing with the housing policy and the housing crisis will feed into resolving and helping to resolve the homelessness issue. And while there may be then specific actions that are needed to deal with to complete dealing with homelessness, that should all be dealt with. And it's hard to escape the fact that there is no political will to deal with the housing issue. I don't believe the way housing has been treated over the last number of years. And okay, we can use the excuse that we've been in the usual thing has been trotted out, that we've been in a very difficult financial situation. We've been reliant on others to keep ourselves going, and all the rest of it, and blame Fianna Fáil as well for putting us in that situation. But the facts are, the government talked about stimulating the economy and talked about trying to encourage people to get people back to work by having activity and stuff like that. And dealing with the housing issue would have been a way to do that. And continuing on with house completions would have stimulated local employment and would have kept people in it and would have paid dividends and returns to the state as well. I think it's telling when you look at the figures and how the figures have declined. When you look at social housing completions have declined from 6,600 in 2007 to 1,000 by the end of 2012, and which have declined even further because there's no new units being built. Housing purchases went from 2,000 in 2007 to 56 at the end of September 2013. And the local authority housing progression went from 7,700 in 2007 to 0 in 2010. And that shows the crisis that's there because of the factors that have been outlined by other deputies: the mortgage crisis, the spiralling rents issue, dealing with those and people's inability to provide for themselves. The number of people dependent and looking for social housing has just mushroomed and just increased hugely. In Donegal, there's 2,600 people on the housing list. And then there's estimated that with the amount of people that are in private rented, on receipt of rent allowance, over 18 months that are prioritised under the housing policy, that brings the figure up to about 4,300. And that's a huge issue to have to deal with. And we see in Donegal, under the leasing programme, 78 houses have been approved, and under the NAMA scheme, 59 houses have been deemed to be acceptable for coming onto the social housing. But yet, absolutely none of that has been completed, and none of those transfers have been completed. So there is a huge crisis, and there's a crisis. We know there's a crisis in Dublin and the county surrounding Dublin because of the pickup in the economy and the increased demand and rising rents. But there's a crisis in rural Ireland as well because of the decline in provision and housing provision from the local authorities that's leaving it very difficult for people to actually meet their own accommodation needs. And it seems to me that the main pitch of government policy is to rely on the private sector through the rental accommodation scheme, through rent allowance, through long-term leasing, and those will not deal with the issues and they will not deal with the problems. In Donegal, there's been 3 houses built in the last 3 years. And the only reason we were able to get those houses built is because they had already been tendered and contractors appointed when the government cut the programme and cut it out. And we had to fight to get those 3 approvals to go to construction, one a year over 2012, 2013 and 2014, for 4,300 people in need of housing assistance. And I think that's telling. And it's time now, as things apparently start to improve, it's time now to start rolling out a building programme and to develop a building programme that deals with the needs of people and deals with the needs for people for housing, but also could help stimulate the local economy and local employment as well. If the government was creative and made sure that social clauses were included in the tendering contracts, made sure that the successful tenderers were actually compliant with all the labour law and the requirements of operating in the 26 counties, which unfortunately in my own county in Donegal County Council has completely neglected over the years, where we see that local contractors haven't been able to compete with contractors from the 6 counties because Donegal County Council simply ignored the requirements of operating in the south for contractors, where contractors couldn't tender on a level playing pitch. And if the government was creative and did those things, we could start to deal with this issue and start to deal with the housing crisis. And I mentioned earlier the rent allowance, and I know it's not your direct responsibility yet, Minister, and it may become in the next while, and you'll have to deal with it. But I think rent allowance is telling, and the responses of the Minister for Social Protection when issues are dealt with around rent allowance and with the Department of Social Protection are basically, it's disgraceful, I believe, and I hope that when it comes under the housing section of the councils that it will be dealt with more properly. I mean, this continual idea of saying that if slashing the amount of subsidy that people can get in rental and saying that, oh, we can't increase it because all we'll do is increase the rents and stuff like that, it's completely wrong. Like, I remember I think it was about 8 months ago, the Department of Social Protection held a presentation in the AV room about the new rent allowance limits that were being introduced and how it was operating and how it was a great system and it was providing for everybody that needed it. And the morning of that system, I went on daft.ie and I searched for properties in Donegal for a single person under the cap that had been placed by the department, and in the entire county there were 4 flats available for rent under this cap for a single person in the entire county. And all the Department of Social Protection has done is developed a black market for landlords, because tenants have no choice but to put in their rent as being under the cap, because they'll be refused rent allowance straight away if they don't, and then they have to pay in cash the difference to the landlords. And that is what has gone on right across the country, and every TD in the country across the country would tell you that, and at that presentation every TD there told the Department of Social Protection, and the response was to turn around and accuse people looking for rent allowance of creating fraud. I mean, that's a bizarre situation for the department to be working under, and they must be working completely in a vacuum if they think that the rent allowance is something that's solving the issue and dealing with the issue. And I think the other thing that rent allowance shows is that the complete failure of the private sector to deal with any of the housing issues, and because landlords will just capitalise on it and use rent allowance, and many landlords then will refuse to take rent allowance from clients as well, which is another unfair outcome of the operation of the system as well. And you see that particularly in the cities, but a lot in rural areas as well, where landlords will just refuse to accept rent allowance clients as tenants. And some of that might be down to the fact that maybe that they're not registered or that the properties aren't known about or whatever, but it is a huge problem. So I think what we have to do, and what the government has to do, is you have to get a building program up and running. And I understand that there is money available from the European Investment Bank for capital programs. Currently it's pitched only towards the voluntary housing sector, and they're not capable of being able to gear up to avail of that money.
Go on, Omage.
Thank you, Cahirler. So this issue needs to be looked at and needs to be dealt with, and can only be dealt with investment, and can only be dealt with public investment, with a major housing program being rolled out right across the country to deal with these issues and to provide for people, and that will have knock-on effects that will be beneficial to the economy and everything else as well, and also providing for people with a basic right and a basic necessity, which is to have a roof over their head. And there is also, Minister, a crisis within local authority housing sections themselves, where local authorities simply cannot afford to renovate houses prior to re-let them again. In some parts of Donegal, there's up to 30 or 40 houses lying vacant for a substantial length of time, many years in some cases, because the local authority is required to pick them up to a standard, which is correct, that it should be at a certain standard before they're re-let, but they simply can't afford it. You're looking at maybe 40,000 to 50,000 euros per house to get them to a stage where they can be re-let. But you're looking at those areas that the entire budget, maintenance budget for the housing section, would be taken up with just dealing with one house, where there could be 30, 40 or more to be dealt with. So those issues have to be addressed as well. And those issues have to be dealt with, and local authorities have to be given the means and the wherewithal to be able to roll over their stock and keep their stock moving and keep people moving into properties to ensure that we can make some inroads into the list. It seems to me that policy has always been, even in the boom times, to ensure that we don't clear the list and we don't provide housing for everybody that needs it to maintain this system of demand and to ensure that people can't be fully dealt with throughout the system. And also just quickly in relation to homelessness, I mean, one of the things that strikes me is, as I walk into the Dáil here in the mornings, is the number of people sleeping rough between the hotel. 5-minute walk, you'll pass at least 3 or 4 people sleeping rough on the way in here. And that's just, in this society, is just an absolute disgrace. And when you look at the number of empty NAMA properties around this city, there is absolutely no reason why it should continue.